Hi everybody, welcome to Abolish the job description, shifting from a job description to a role description. So welcome, we've got people all over the globe, obviously people in Australia as well, so welcome. It'll always be all sorts of time zones regarding this webinar, so good morning, good evening or good afternoon, wherever you might be. So this is the second time I've run this webinar, and the reason, I guess, is that there's been enormous interest in the whole topic of job descriptions. I think we all know at some level that there's fundamentally something wrong with job descriptions, and it's a bit like it's a little bit like performance reviews. We often think that the best way to deal with it is just to tinker at the edges or perhaps give people more training or whatever. My view is that the tool itself is really something that is part of the last century, and we really need to move on and talk about role descriptions. And when I talk about role descriptions, I'm not really saying that this is old wine in new bottles. A lot of people think it might be just a job title change or whatever. It's actually a fundamentally different way of capturing what people do at work. So let's get into it, and what I'd suggest is if you've got any questions, which I'm sure you'll have, if you go to the right hand side and just click on the question box there and just type in your question, I'll deal with questions at the end of the webinar because I want to just get through a whole lot of content, and then in approximately 45 minutes I'll start answering questions. Alright, so let's get underway. So there's fundamentally three things that I would like you to get out of this webinar today. I guess the first thing is to understand the value and importance of non-job roles that people play. And I think it sounds like a strange sort of term, non-job role, but people are playing non-job or performing non-job roles every day. And I'd just like to look at what those particular non-job roles are, and there's four that I believe that are fundamentally critical to your success, irrespective of whether your business is a professional services firm, a public sector, private sector, small, large. People are expected to perform these non-job roles, and I'll talk a little bit about those in more detail. Okay. Secondly, we will learn the process of actually converting job descriptions to role descriptions as such. So let's have a look at what they might look like as well. And finally, the last thing I hope that you'll get out of this webinar is some key performance indicators around the important roles that employees are continually performing in the workplace, particularly as they relate to non-job roles. And one of the reasons I think that non-job roles are not embedded in the job description is that they're so difficult to measure, or because they're highly subjective, people shy away from them. So I want to talk about KPIs in relation to those four non-job roles that I mentioned. Okay. I personally think the greatest, most influential management thinker ever was an engineer by the name of Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor was a gentleman who was invited by Henry Ford to come into his motor company and basically improve productivity. And what he actually did is he went around the assembly line and he basically quarantined different jobs that people did. So he basically was looking at reducing margins of error and basically putting boundaries around the roles that people played on that assembly line, and that became what was called scientific management. So you've got Deming and you've got people like Drucker, but I don't believe that anyone's more influential in this world than Frederick Taylor when it comes to management thinking. So I think the job description has been born out of the industrial era that Frederick Taylor was involved in. Frederick Taylor didn't design the job description, but certainly the concept of scientific management had a lot to do with how the job description evolved. So I just wanted to challenge you with this concept that if you think about the most job descriptions that we have, what we're trying to do is to quarantine what people do in their work. So we're putting a boundary around it and basically saying to people, here's a chunk of activity, here's some key result areas. We want you to go ahead and achieve that in the interest of helping this business move forward or this organisation. The only problem with that, of course, is that at the end of the job description, there nearly always is this legal disclaimer, and that is you are required to complete any other duties deemed relevant by your manager. So you kind of think, well, what's the point? I mean, if we've got this legal disclaimer at the end of this document, why should we, why can't we quarantine everything that people do? And the fundamental reason for that is that we just can't. We cannot put everything down on a piece of paper that people are expected to do in the world of work. And that's why we put the legal disclaimer in there. So really, that's job descriptions are the butt of Dilbert type jokes, and that we see all the time about job descriptions. So I honestly think there must be a better way, and a new book of mine coming out later this year is actually called The End of the Job Description, shifting from a job focus to a performance focus, and that book is coming out. You can pre-book it at this stage if you wish, and it's very much based on the lines of The End of the Performance Review, which was a previous book of mine. But at any rate, you can see that the legal disclaimer makes a mockery of the job description. So before we go any further, let's try to understand where the role description fits into the performance management framework. So this is a framework, a fairly simple framework that I put together, but nevertheless it's applicable whether it's a corner store or a large multinational. The principles are pretty much the same. An organisation needs, of course, a vision statement. That is a statement of where they're intending to go. It's aspirational. It's usually quite positive, hopefully inspiring. It's basically letting people know in the organisation what the aspiration for that business is. Many of these vision statements are way too long, way too complicated, and way too boring. We need something aspirational and inspirational. So the statement tells us where we're going. Then we have a mission statement, which is basically how we'll get there. So the mission statement will describe in a few words what the organisation has to do in order to achieve its vision. And once again, I've seen many of these written over 2 or 3 pages, which really does not suit the bill. We really should be able to encapsulate this in 1 or 2 sentences and no more. The third element of the performance management framework is a set of core values, and these are values by which the organisation operates under. So these are the behaviours which drive the mission, which help to achieve the vision. Now, once again, people are often very cynical about these things, and they're often a plaque on the wall, and people often pay lip service to them. But nevertheless, if we can't describe a set of behaviours that an organisation is expected to operate by, I think we're in a lot of strife. The next element is actually the role description, and if it was a job description, this would fit in exactly in this spot too. So the role description basically is linked closely to the vision, mission, and core values of the organisation. In fact, I'd even argue that the role description should have that documentation in it, embedded in it. Too many times I've seen job descriptions that are isolated and have nothing to do with the strategic direction of the organisation, and of course that's a real issue. So it's got to be linked in very carefully with the organisational vision and mission and values. And then of course most role descriptions and job descriptions have 6 to 8 key result areas, and these are the areas that we expect people to venture into. Any more than 8 and it becomes confusing, so my suggestion is always to collapse it down to no more than 8 headings. And then we have some key performance indicators, and despite the misunderstanding here, key performance indicators are really how we're going to measure, not what the measurement itself is. So this is the how-to, and there are only basically two ways of measuring anything. We can either measure it by a number, or we can measure it by a process, and we often call these qualitative or quantitative measures. So these are the measures, and then once we've worked out how we're going to measure, we have a target or targets, a set of targets. So these are actually the targets. The targets could be the numbers, or they could be following a particular set process or procedure. So in a nutshell, that's the performance management framework. So you can see that the job description fits very much in the middle of that process and is an integral part of the performance management framework. So in other words, what I'm actually arguing that a work document is extremely important. I'm just simply making the point that the work document that we have at the moment, which we normally call the job description, is not really working for a modern workplace. It might have worked during the 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, but it certainly doesn't work anymore. So let's have a look at this in a little bit more depth. I just want to make a point before we move into these non-job roles that organisations have what we call a psychological contract, and psychological meaning in the head, contract meaning an exchange between two or more parties, in this case two. The individual, when an individual comes into the workplace, they are willing to offer certain things to a particular employer. And in exchange, the organisation has certain expectations of what that individual can offer. So at a very basic level, one of those would be to turn up on time. Another one would be to, to contribute, do a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and so forth. So this is a contract that's unwritten in the head, in the minds of the manager and the employee. On the other hand, of course, the individual expects certain things from the organisation, and the organisation is willing to offer certain things. So when these things are aligned, of course, we have a psychological contract, and when they're misaligned, we don't, and this is where a lot of tension and problems are caused in the workplace. So I mention this because what's really important is that the role description can fundamentally alter the psychological contract. In fact, the job description actually maintains a traditional psychological contract, which is not the contract that you actually need and want moving forward in terms of becoming an employer of choice. So let's just have a look. I don't want to go through my new employment relationship model, but I just wanted to point out that we're going to look at one particular value on that in that relationship. This is the new psychological contract that I'm referring to, and we're going to talk about performance. And in particular, we're going to talk about performance focus. So how can we actually get people to perform more at work is fundamentally the question that I'm trying to answer here. So I'm going to make a provocative statement here, and I'll back it up, hopefully, but my statement is simply this, that the roles that people play in organisations are more important than the jobs they do. Sounds a little bit provocative, but I believe it to be very true. I think that people, when they come to work, actually play or perform a range of different roles. The most fundamental role they play is carrying out a job, but they also carry out, in my case, 4 additional non-job roles, which I want to talk about. So let me break this down for you so that you can understand what I mean by these non-job roles. So if we think about the work that people do, and this can apply to any sort of work. This can apply to blue collar, white collar, knowledge worker, you name it. This applies to everybody. So all work is packaged this way. We have a job role that people play, and in that job role, of course, there is a range of technical skills that people are expected to take on. Now, what the job description does is fundamentally encapsulate that job role. So the job description actually does, I think, a pretty good job at outlining what the job role a person's expected to play. So there's no problem there, and there's nothing that we actually necessarily have to do to change that. What we've got to try and do is understand that it's only part of a bigger equation of what performance really is. Because on the other side, there are a range of non-job roles that people play. And we've known this for a long time. And what happens is that we've never really been able to identify some universally acceptable roles that apply to all industries and all businesses. And the other issue that we've had is we've had some issues around how we might measure these non-job roles. So what's happened as a result of that is we've kind of left them off the list, literally, so they don't become part of this job description that I talk about. So let's have a look at these 4 fundamental roles, non-job roles, that I believe that every employee in every industry, in every culture, is required to play, and they're required to play this more and more. One of those, and they're not necessarily in any order, is one of the roles that we're expecting, non-job roles we're expecting employees to play in the workplace, is to come to work with a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. Now, all of us in this webinar today could instantly cite 2 or 3 people that aren't playing that role. But my argument is, isn't that a reasonable expectation, that we expect people to come to work with a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm? I'm not suggesting for a minute that they should be bouncing off the walls and so forth, but they should be solution-focused. They should be enabling, encouraging, and so forth. And I don't think that's an unreasonable requirement. In fact, it's the number 1 requirement that managers identify as critical for success in the workplace. And I'll get to that in a moment. So that's the first fundamental role. Now, I guess many of you, and I have myself when I've managed people, have actually had to pull people up about the fact that they're not playing this role, that they might be negative in a meeting and, basically putting down other people's suggestions or sabotaging the goodwill in the team. And I've had to call them into the office, and I'm sure many of you have had to do that. And I've actually had to point out to them that it's really important that they be positive, or at least not destructive in their relationships with their colleagues. And some people will actually say at that point, well, it's not written in my job description anywhere that I've got to be a nice person. I get on with my job, I come to work, I do it, and that's all that's important. Well, in fact, it's not all that's important. It's actually critically important that people actually demonstrate a positive mental attitude at work. It obviously has an impact on morale, team building, and so forth. So why don't we embed that in the role description? The second role that I believe that everybody, irrespective of their industry or their job or whatever, is expected to perform is the team role. We're expecting people to be able to operate in teams. People are operating more and more in teams than they ever have. Of course, organisations are a lot flatter. We have a lot more cross-functional communication. And we're expecting people, obviously, to get along with people in a team environment, whether it be a temporary team or a permanent team. And I don't think it's an unreasonable request, again, that we expect people to be team players. But again, every one of you in this webinar would know people that clearly don't perform that role. And by embedding that in a work document called a role description, we are making a very clear statement to people that we expect you to come to work, and we expect you not only to have a positive attitude, but we also expect you to be able to work and operate in a team environment. Not an unreasonable request. Now, the third role that is applicable to all industries right across the board is a skill development role. We actually want people to come to work continually growing and developing as an individual and an employee. And this is not just for our interests as a manager. We want them to do that for themselves so that in fact they can become more employable. But again, every one of us in this webinar can recognise individuals who've stopped growing and make excuses such as, I'm too old to learn, or I'm quite comfortable doing this role, this job over here. I don't really want to expand my job any further. We're all familiar with those sorts of people, but I don't think that's reasonable. I don't buy that. I think people are required to continually grow and develop. Otherwise, they become completely redundant and useless to our business. So it's certainly reasonable to expect people to grow and develop as an individual in an organisation. And the fourth and final non-job role that I think is critical in any organisation is the innovation and continuous improvement role. And what I mean by that is we're expecting people to bring their ideas, suggestions, thoughts, and inspiration to work in order to make the workplace a better place. And of course, since Peter Senge 25 years ago talked about the learning organisation, we are still grappling with it now in 2015. How do we unlock and unleash the potential of individuals to help them grow and develop the organisation as well as themselves? And I believe the first and fundamental way of doing that is to actually embed a statement into the work document that clearly says that we expect you to perform this role at work. We expect you to add value to the workplace that you are working in. Not an unreasonable request, I shouldn't imagine. So, whereas the skill development role is about working on the person themselves, the innovation and continuous improvement role is about working on the organisation and the workplace that people belong to. So these are the four non-job roles, and I think what's happening in the world of work is that these four non-job roles are becoming more and more relevant and critical to the success of employees and organisations. But because they're either not included in the job description, or if they are included, they're usually included as a couple of bullet points at the bottom of the description at the end, people get the idea that they're not that important. What's really important is what's over on the left-hand side. As long as I do my technical work well, or at least in a way accepting a minimum acceptable standard performance, everything else will take care of itself. But I'm actually suggesting to you that performance is a lot bigger than just doing your job. Performance is about the attitude that you have, the way you interact with your team and colleagues, whether you're willing to grow and develop and obviously share and use those skills in your current workplace, and whether you're willing to add value to the workplace. All of those things are critical to organisational success. Now, just to make the point and demonstrate to you, this is a busy slide, I understand that, but if you have a look, you'll notice that up the top, it's entitled the 10 most valued job skills. Now, this was a survey conducted for 9,000 people across 21 industries. So it's a pretty extensive survey. And what these managers were asked was a very simple question. If there was one particular attribute that you'd like to see in an employee starting in your business, what would it be? And of course, everybody wrote down what that attribute was. And what you can see now is an aggregation of those attributes. So the number one attribute across those 9,000 managers, as you can see, is enthusiasm and a positive attitude. So managers are saying that is the number one role, if you like, or attribute we expect people to play at work. Now, if you cast your eyes down that column on content, putting aside the key questions over on the right-hand side, but if you cast your eyes down there, what you notice is that they are all non-job roles. There are no job roles on that list. So it's fairly obvious that people have a very high value or place a very high value on non-job roles. And yet when you look at the job description and you consider the way we recruit and select people, our obsession is with what's over on the left-hand side on the previous slide, our obsession is looking at the technical attributes of the individual, and we bypass the non-job roles on the right-hand side. So just wanted to demonstrate that this is not just my view of the world, this is the view of many, many people out there, that we really need to capture these non-job roles. So what's the difference actually between a job description and a role description? Well, a lot of people ask me and say, well, you know, we've just written our job descriptions, so I really don't want to go back and start throwing them out and writing role descriptions. The good news for you is this is a very easy exercise to implement. So first of all, the job description usually defines a set of specific tasks and responsibilities that are performed by a particular job holder. Okay. Of course, they are the technical aspects of their work. Now, a role description, on the other hand, defines the job role, the technical tasks, and the non-job roles that employees are expected to perform at work. So, in other words, on the assumption that your job descriptions are reasonably well written, all you need to do then is retrofit the 4 non-job roles that we talked about to that document, giving the non-job roles the same status as the job role or the key result areas, so that what we're doing is elevating up the list these non-job roles in terms of priority for individuals, and we're going to write them in as much detail, and I'm going to give you some suggestions on how we do that. So the difference is really just value adding to what's already there on the left-hand side. Now, of course, if your job descriptions are written very poorly from a technical point of view, then I'm afraid you've got work to do, but you probably know that anyway. It means you've got to go back and rewrite those. That's step 1. Then step 2 is to turn those job descriptions into role descriptions. So what I'll do now is I'll spend a little bit of time going through each of those 4 non-job roles and give you some key performance indicators around these non-job roles, so that you've got a better understanding of what they actually look like. So one of the key performance indicators around, I think, of being positive in the workplace is to have a solution focus, not a problem focus. So people who are solution focused are looking for ways and means of resolving the inevitable problems they deal with day to day. Often they show their own initiative and they do all sorts of things, but basically their orientation is around problem solving. They will work towards coming to a solution, whereas people who don't have a positive mental attitude will tend to whinge and complain about the problem, often to you and me, and really it's quite draining when we just want them to come back to us with a solution. Another key result area is autonomy. So this is the degree to which the employee is able to work without close supervision. Obviously, if you have to micromanage somebody, it's normally because their attitude is not what it needs to be. So what I would suggest is that people who can get on and do their job with minimal supervision probably have the right attitude and enthusiasm for the particular role. And these are people that are a pleasure to work with, obviously. So that would be another indicator that I think is very important. A third indicator is just positive energy, just the vibe that people give off when they're around other people. You know, some people are so energy sapping, you just want to get out of there as fast as you can. So positive energy is the degree to which the employee demonstrates a positive and cooperative attitude towards their work and their colleagues. So like a can-do sort of attitude to life, to be able to do those sort of things. So I think that basically these 3 indicators are the way that we should look at people in terms of this non-job role of having positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. I'll go into a bit more detail about how we measure those in a moment, but I just want to get through the other 3 non-job roles before we go any further. Now, the team role, I think one of the indicators is leadership, which might seem a bit strange because we're talking about people who are part of a team. But I think if you're really a team player, what are you actually doing or not doing? I think one of the things that you're doing is that you have an ability at the right time, at the right place, in the right way to be able to influence your team in certain ways. Otherwise, you're just a passive spectator in a team. So we're expecting people who are team players to be able to influence during meetings and get-togethers and not just be a passive participant. We're also expecting that people will feel a sense of accountability, and I guess there's a dual accountability here. We want people to be accountable for their job role, of course, but we also want people to be accountable for the total team output. So we're actually interested in people having a genuine interest and concern with the team output. Where I'm looking for that. So the flip side of that would be someone to say, look, I've done my job, I've done my bit, I don't know what happens next, and frankly, I don't care. I've done what I need to do. That, of course, wouldn't be exhibiting accountability in a team environment. So there's two there, and moving on to skill development role, there are two again that I think are really important indicators. So when we're talking about skill, I think there's two types of development we're considering here. One of those is a self-development concept, which really is about developing yourself as a person. So if you're developing yourself constantly by doing a whole range of things, going to courses, reading, there's a myriad ways of being able to develop yourself, then you're exhibiting at least half of this particular role. And the other half, as you could probably gather, is around the technical development space. So we want people who are prepared to develop themselves as people and develop themselves as employees, and we want to see evidence of that. And if we can see evidence of that, then they're definitely playing the skill development role. And you and I, again, know people who have this a little bit out of whack. So there are people that I know that spend enormous energy developing themselves technically, but make no effort whatsoever to do any personal development or self-development. So whilst technically they're very sound on the personal development front, they've often got quite a few flaws. And I've seen the flip side, although not quite as obvious, but I've seen the flip side where people work very hard on themselves, but not on the technical aspects of their job. Both of those things are critically important, and they are the responsibility of the individual, although the organisation, of course, is there to help. But we're expecting people to come to work exhibiting that role. Now, the continuous improvement and innovation role has a number of attributes to it. In order to be innovative and continuously improving, and we're not looking for, Einsteins or, we're not after that sort of person. We're after people who are constantly problem solving and critically thinking. We want people who are, asking why a lot. We're wanting people to identify and define and critically analyze and resolve work problems. We want that sort of, and problem solving and critical thinking is a key indicator for that, because obviously if people aren't doing that, they're highly unlikely to come up with particular ways, better ways of doing things. Now, surprise, surprise, I think another indicator of innovation, continuous improvement, is actually customer responsiveness, because arguably everything that's said, done, and thought about in an organisation is really about the end user, the customer. So obviously the old adage, if you're not serving somebody who is a customer, you're probably serving somebody who is serving a customer. So looking at the capacity to respond to identify, understand, build relationships and adapt requirements to internal and external customers, I think is a critically important indicator of innovation and continuous improvement. So if you've got those two things going for you, you're likely to be exhibiting or performing that role. Look, here's a list just briefly before we move on. When we're talking about innovation and continuous improvement, we're not talking about, implementing touchscreen technology or something like that. We're actually looking at things like improving quality, reducing time, reducing costs, increasing output, increasing safety, meeting deadlines, enhancing interpersonal cooperation and streamlining systems and processes. All of those things are open for a new way of doing things, which is innovation, or an improvement on current things, which is continuous improvement. So you can see that if we embed this role into the work document, the role description, and that means we're giving people serious feedback on this, it's likely that we're going to start elevating the importance of this role in the culture of the organisation, which is exactly what we want to do. And now I just wanted to talk a little bit around the measurement of these. We can actually measure these, and we use I wouldn't call it a crowdsourcing, but I'd call it more a 360-degree methodology, where an individual who once a year would be up for having their boss giving some input around those 4 roles, themselves as individuals giving some input around those 4 roles, and perhaps some workers, some of their colleagues confidentially giving some input around those roles. So, for example, if one of the statements was, he is a good listener, which would clearly fall into 2 of those roles, positive mental attitude and enthusiasm, and team role, he is a good listener, and 12 colleagues say, no, he is not, then clearly it is a very strong indication that person's got to work on their listening skills. And in that time when the manager sits down with that particular employee to review their performance, which of course should be an ongoing concern, they can raise that issue with them, and that has some validity because these are the perceptions of 12 colleagues. So therefore, perception is reality in the eye of the beholder. So we do have the ability to be able to crunch numbers and give people clear indications so that next year we can actually say to people, okay, next year, let's see if we can change the numbers somewhat. How about we get a better feedback next year, because it'll be the same questions potentially asked to the same people. So that's a process that we can use. But I can certainly give you more information about that if you're interested. Just let me know, but we don't have enough time to go into that in great detail. So how do we actually formulate these role descriptions? So yes, I've given you some statements, absolutely, but I think those statements need to be tailored to your organisational culture. So there are ways of doing that, and the way that I would strongly recommend that you do this is in a collaborative way. It's not difficult because, as I said to you, hopefully half the document is already written, which is the job description. So we now have 5 roles, the job description and 4 non-job roles, which make up the role description. Here are some ways of actually finessing that document. So those statements, those indicators that I went through before, are totally applicable to the work that people do in that particular context and workplace. The dynamic duo method is really where the manager might sit down with 2 individuals who do the same job. So they might be accounts receivable clerks, for example. They do exactly the same work. They have exactly the same job description. So it would make sense for the manager to simply sit down with them and to share with them the indicators around the 4 non-job roles and ask them how applicable they are to the work they do, and more importantly, how are they applicable, as in how can we change the wording to suit the work that they do. That's important because we want these accounts receivable clerks to be totally committed to these non-job roles, and if we work with them in a collaborative sense, they're likely to be more committed than not. So that's one strategy. Now, this strategy is very useful where you've got, say, 5 accounts receivable clerks, and you don't want to get them all together, so you just get 2 of them together to work with you to form the document on behalf of everybody else. Of course, the other option is to get the whole team together. So if there is a team of 5 people, you can get them all in the same room, and you can basically work with them to talk to them about their particular roles. The trouble with this method, of course, is that if you get more than 4 in the room, it can take a little bit longer than otherwise, because you've basically got 4 opinions in the room, and you need to listen to those 4 opinions. But this might be very useful if you're trying to develop teamwork and clarity and understanding across a team. So the team method is certainly one way of formulating these role descriptions, without a doubt. Other approaches, you've got the incumbent supervisor method, and that's where where there's only one person in that role. The manager would actually sit down with that one person and formulate the non-job role description descriptors with that person, simply because there's no one else. So basically it's just the manager and the employee who would work together to basically craft those statements to reflect the work that they do. So that works. Another method is where an employee completes the document him or herself, and this is very applicable where you have roles where there's only one employee, or it's a vacant or even a new position. So this is a new position that's never been created before. We've got an employee in there, there's no track record, there's no job description, there's nothing. So we have to actually ask that employee to start to consider those 4 non-job roles and how they apply to their particular work. And we also should ask that employee to consider how the job role is considered as well. And they go ahead and they craft a statement and use it as a tool to discuss that with their particular manager until they both agree that's what the work looks like. That's what the work document should contain. Many of you who have purchased and read my book, The End of the Performance Review, would be aware of the 5 conversations framework. Essentially, and I don't want to go into this in great detail because we're coming towards the end, but I just want to make the point that really what these non-job roles are actually doing is broadening the definition of performance in the workplace beyond the technical confines of what people do. And by broadening performance beyond the technical confines of what people are doing, it gives managers a huge opportunity to have more performance conversations, which they should be doing anyway. And those of you familiar with my work would understand that I believe very strongly in performance conversations done on a regular and consistent basis. This is just one of many frameworks that can be used for that. If you want more information, more than happy to talk to you about that at a later stage. Which basically brings us pretty much to the end of our webinar, and I just put a little advertisement there. The book, The End of the Role Description, or The End of the Job Description, sorry, that'll be out later this year through Palgrave Macmillan. You can certainly order your copy, pre-order your copy, and I've given you the details there. You'll get a copy of this presentation, or at least a link to it, so you can get that information and basically order your copy early. Others of you might be very interested in exploring the ways of converting your job descriptions to role descriptions, and I'm more than happy to help you in that regard. So you can send me an email at tim@winnersatwork.com.au, and I'll be more than happy to assist, because today has really been a little bit of an overview as to how the process works. The book, of course, goes into great detail about all of the concepts that I went through in relation to converting job descriptions to role descriptions. So at this stage, if you've got some questions, type them in there and I'm more than happy to answer those. So let's go through and have a look and see. Okay, one question here is how long does the process take to convert job descriptions to role descriptions? Well, look, it very much depends. I think it depends very much on how well your job descriptions are written. If they're formatted correctly right across the board and you put a lot of energy and so forth, then it's going to take you very little time. As I said earlier in the webinar, it'll take you very little time to be able to do this. And the reason is because you've really got to just take 4 non-job roles, embed them into the documentation. They will become key result areas. So you've probably got 6 to 8, you're adding another 4. In terms of the indicators, you've got some collaborative ways of being able to develop that with other people, and you can go ahead and do that. So I don't think it should take you very long at all. And in fact, I think it's not an exercise where somebody in HR should have to do this. I think it's an exercise where all managers or supervisors should be sitting down with their people going through that process. So it creates a collaborative approach. So certainly it's not a long-winded process. Okay, other questions. I'm just having a look over here. Okay. Okay, another question here is in relation to the measurement tool that I went through. This person's asking me how is the measurement tool administered? The measurement tool is administered online, so it's done through an email process. People actually have a number of statements to complete in relation to their observations of their colleagues. So each person in the team, for example, once a year would sit down and complete their evaluations of each other. Their manager would do the same, and so would the individuals themselves, and all of that information is aggregated into a report, and that report then is the source of a conversation, a performance conversation between the manager and the individual. And so they look at ways and means of being able to develop and grow and build upon those non-job roles that we talked about earlier. So that's how that approach works, and I have found from my own experience it works extremely well. Most employees understand intuitively that they're expected to play these roles, but they're a little bit puzzled that no one makes a big deal of it. It's not written in the job description, so therefore it can't be all that important. And as you saw before, most managers understand the value of these non-job roles. So, and this is the irony. The irony is that when we've got a non-performing employee, it's often because they're not performing the non-job roles rather than the job role. And when they're not performing the non-job role, because we haven't embedded all of that information into the work document, we have to find a excuse to sack them, and we'll go straight to the technical aspects of their work. Yet what's really the problem is the fact that they're not a team player or they're a pain in the you-know-what to work with. So what we do is we just kind of have to find some sort of a technical way to legally dismiss this person. But obviously, if you include and embed these non-job roles into your expectations of what people do, then it gives you far greater legal clout to be able to performance manage somebody based on these non-job roles that we mentioned before. So yes, there is a question here in relation to the legal aspects of this. Obviously, if this is part of the expectations of what people do in their job, in their work, in their role, then clearly you can hold people accountable for these 4 non-job roles. And not only can you, you should. And not only can you and should, you've also got opportunities to collect data to demonstrate whether people are performing in that role. So just imagine if your organisation had a complete commitment to those 4 non-job roles, your productivity, your performance organisationally would go through the roof, because the thing that's letting people down is attitude, being a team player, not willing to continually grow and develop, and not offering ways and means of adding value to the organisation. Those are the things that are missing fundamentally in organisations. And one of the reasons they're missing, or a very important reason why they're missing, is that the job description doesn't seem to capture any of that stuff. And it should. But if it does, it no longer becomes a job description, it becomes a role description. All right, that looks like it's the last question. I don't have any others, but look, please, if you've got questions, send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer those questions for you if you've thought of questions subsequent to the webinar. I'd like to thank you very much for your participation. Not that you've done much today, but your interest at least. Thank you very much. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it thought-provoking. And I hope you found it inspiring enough to be able to go away and look at your work documents in a different light. I think it will make a fundamental difference to your workplace, and it's well worth the effort. And if you said to me, if there was one place I should work at to actually assist my organisation perform, then this would be the place, because this is the fundamental building block of everything. Performance appraisals, succession planning, recruitment and selection, all of those things basically come from the work document. So if we can get the work document correct, then it's going to make a huge difference to performance. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and all the very best.